to Wisconsin would have at least come across to Professor Ian Coxhead. I did went there as the exchange student, and Ian was the I suppose the overall the caretaker of the Thai student in economics overall. So Ian is presenting on a very interesting topic: do export booms discourage schooling? Evidence from Indonesia, but of course with the broader relevant lessons to other countries such as Thailand. But we can start. Yes.
Let's see. Does that work? No? This one? Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you, Ton, and thank you all for coming. And I'm going to begin with some apologies, of course, because I'm not a distinguished professor, just a regular professor. So the paper I'm going to present is a paper which is evolving as we speak. So there are some new estimation results that I'm going to show you, different from the paper if you've received the paper. Not too different, but a little bit different. And then the other apology is this is a very big paper. It covers too many topics, and so there's a chance that I will talk too long. And I promise you I'll try not to. And Ton, you're going to tell me to stop, right? Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to make sure I do that. If you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to stop me. And the goal of this talk is to talk about Indonesia, but on a topic which I think is also of interest to people in Thailand and other middle-income economies. So even though I'm going to talk about Indonesian data, I think that there are some other lessons that we can learn along the way, and I'm going to try to begin and end with that broader discussion. So that's where I'll go. The big topic, though, is one that links the structure of an open economy to incentives to acquire human capital, and asks in a kind of negative way, do export booms discourage schooling? So that's where I'll begin. So we know that for every country in Southeast Asia, except Singapore, the very big issue is how to sustain growth through middle income. Everyone in Thailand already knows this, of course. It's easy to get early economic growth by transferring people out of agriculture into other industries. You can do that with relatively low cost and relatively low investments in things like human capital. But then how do you get to the next stage in which you can become a country that is on the same trajectory as Korea or Taiwan or even Malaysia? And it's not clear that Thailand or Indonesia have managed to meet the conditions yet that will allow them to continue growing in that way. So we all know that education is a very important part of that. That's why I'm going to explore this topic. And I'm going to look at the Indonesian experience, because there we have a recent episode of major structural change in the Indonesian economy. And that structural change gives us an opportunity to see how the economy's growth experience, and particularly its interaction with the rest of the world, is linked to labor markets, and how changes in labor markets then link to incentives to acquire education. So that's the chain that I'm going to follow. And I'm going to do this by mainly by estimating earnings functions and looking at the determinants of returns to education, because that's going to be our indicator of incentives to stay in school through middle school and maybe beyond middle school as well. So we're going to look at essentially the expected returns to an educational investment by young Indonesians. And we're going to do so in the context of an economy where the structure of labor demand is changing very fast, from different industries and different occupations and different kinds of rewards to different workers with different characteristics. So I'm going to try to unpack all of that when we run the earnings functions. If I still have time left over, if you haven't stopped me, then we'll go from a static look to some dynamic analysis, looking at different cohorts of the labor market through this period. And then I'll try to draw some lessons from that, in particular linking the macroeconomic shocks that affect an open economy like Indonesia, or for that matter, like Thailand, to earnings of labor in a changing labour market, and from that to changes in the returns to investments in education. And I'll try to finish by thinking about, once again, about the big issues of how to move through middle income and beyond to become a wealthy, highly educated, technologically advanced and creative, dynamic economy. So I should tell you right now, I don't have the answer. All I have is more questions, but maybe they're good questions to ask anyway. Okay, so that's the overview. When we, I apologize if you can't see the bottom row of the table, of the screen. When we think about moving through middle income, we know that the dynamism of the manufacturing sector in any Southeast Asian or East Asian economy is of first order importance. Why? Because manufacturing, more than any other sector in general, is technologically dynamic. It can make very good use of skills through the complementarity of capital with skills. And so the growth of manufacturing generates additional demand for skilled workers. It also generates additional growth through network effects of various kinds, spillovers of knowledge and other things from one firm to another, one industry to another. So there's a lot of complementarity between investments in manufacturing and increasing returns to education, and we see that in the cases of countries like Korea and Taiwan. The evidence is very strong on that. Indonesia, like many Southeast Asian economies, and partly like Thailand, not exactly, is much more resource-based than manufacturing-based. And what we've learned in the last 15 or 20 years is that resource-intensive economies, resource-based economies, have a hard time growing at the kind of miracle rates of growth that we see in, say, China or in Korea and Taiwan during their fast period of economic growth. It seems like there's a kind of a speed limit on economic growth for countries like Indonesia and maybe Thailand as well, around about 5 or 6% per year. And that speed limit is partly because the nature of a resource-rich economy is that it doesn't have as many externalities from growth. It doesn't have network gains that we see in manufacturing. There's not so much technological dynamism. There's much more vulnerability to global market volatility. And so for all of these and other reasons, it's hard to get sustained high rates, very high rates of economic growth in a resource-rich economy. Furthermore, we know that there are Dutch disease effects that come with resource blooms, and those Dutch disease effects are associated with the growth of sectors in the economy which are not generally very skill intensive, particularly service sectors, sectors based on the rising value of land, so property development, for example. Also sectors based on very income elastic provision of things like education, health services, basic things, housing, personal services, in domestic tourism, wholesale trade, retail trade, local transport, all of those kinds of things which are very important and very income elastic, but not in general very skill intensive industries. So these are the industries that tend to grow very fast along with the resource sector in an economy like Indonesia undergoing an export boom as Indonesia did during the 2000s. Very different growth path, if you like, to that of a resource-poor economy with a lot of comparative advantage in manufacturing, for example. And so then the big question is, well, does that pattern of growth that we see then have an implication for sustained economic growth, for things that we care about, poverty alleviation, and especially inequality? So these are very big general questions. Now I'm going to try to zoom in both on the Indonesia case and on the specific question about education. So far, so good? Okay. If I'm talking too fast, it's because I get excited by my topic, and you have to tell me, oh, cha-cha. Okay. So that's your responsibility. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about Indonesia, give you some data to motivate this study, and then turn to the education story. Okay, so we all know that Indonesia had a very big economic crisis in the late 1990s, followed by a very big boom based on resource exports in the 2000s from about 2001 to about 2012. It's been associated with steady growth at a pretty high rate, 5 or 6%, but that seems to be about the maximum rate of growth. And the indicators of things that we really care about, like poverty decline, are pretty good in Indonesia. Poverty has fallen from almost half the population in 1991 to about 12% in 2012. However, that's associated also with two worrying things. One is a very big rise in inequality, and the other is a persistence, not so much of poverty, but of clustering around the poverty line. So when we look at the distribution of income around the poverty line in Indonesia, we see that even though only a small percentage of the population officially falls below the poverty line, almost 60% of the population is in the range from below the poverty line to 2 times the poverty line, which is still a very low income. So there's a very large, the majority of the population is not exactly in poverty, but not exactly out of poverty either. They remain vulnerable to a shock, a macroeconomic shock, or a health crisis, something like that, that can push them back below the poverty line quite quickly. They remain very vulnerable to that. So Indonesia has just made it into a middle income, but they're just over the line, not very far over the line. All of this has been driven primarily by the growth of resource exports. So there's been a lot of GDP growth, aggregate income growth, and along with that there's been Dutch disease, so an appreciation of the real exchange rate, a rise in the prices of non-tradables like personal services and housing relative to tradable sector products. And that has been associated with a relative decline of the growth of manufacturing and manufacturing employment, as we'll see in just a moment. Some other things have also been taking place during this time. I should note those. One is that the Asian financial crisis created a very big problem for Indonesia, and it took them a long time in terms of investment rates and the growth of industries generally, a long time to recover from that. The other is that Indonesia's economic policy settings have not always been ideal either. There's been a lot of policy tightening on labor market policies, restrictions on things like minimum wage, hiring and firing, stuff like that. And these have also impeded profitability growth, especially in modern sector industries, formal sector, like manufacturing. So there's a lot of things happening, but the resource boom has been the biggest part of this story by far. Okay, some quick data. Per capita income growth in Indonesia. The lower line, the green line here, is the per capita GDP growth rate. Here's the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, and then the moving average, 3-year moving average of growth, converges back to about 5% per year during the 2000s, during this resource export boom. In terms of its relative role in the world, income, we see that per capita income as a percentage of world average income in Indonesia rises from the 60s, about 6 or 7% of world income. By the 2000s, it's hitting almost 20%, almost 1/5 of the world average income. So there's been, good progress there in terms of aggregate growth and aggregate income growth. Those things are nice to see, of course. And as I mentioned, the poverty story that goes with that is also very promising. Here are the $2 a day. That's incorrect. These are the $1 a day numbers. These are the $2 a day numbers, so ignore that mention. $2 a day poverty has fallen pretty consistently. $1 a day. $2 a day poverty has also fallen pretty consistently. And so we see this sustained decline in poverty. That's good. But again, a lot of clustering around the poverty line. So many Indonesians are in this kind of middle group where they're not counted as poor, but they're really only just above the poverty line, within the multiple of 2 of that poverty line. Finally, I mentioned inequality. Just look at the purple number here. That's the Gini coefficient up to 2012. In Indonesia, historically, the Gini was in the low 0.3 range. It has risen up to the low 0.4 range during this, particularly during this resource boom that's taken place. And then let me jump to the structure of production in the economy. before the Asian financial crisis, back here in the 1990s, we see that the relative contribution of industry, including manufacturing, to overall GDP growth, that's the height of the bar, in Indonesia, was pretty big. So in the pre-crisis years, industry was growing at an average rate of, it was contributing about 4 percentage points to total economic growth each year on average. When we look at the post-crisis years of the resource export boom of the 2000s, we see total growth still at 5.5%, but the contribution of industry, including manufacturing, has fallen. Now it contributes only about 1.9, a little bit less than 2% of overall economic growth. And you can see that that role has switched with services. So that by the 2000s, services, that's the purple bar, are contributing much more to overall economic growth in Indonesia than is industry. So there's been a change in the structure of output, and that's reflected in the contributions of industry and services to overall economic growth. And of course, agriculture's role, that's the red bar, has been very low all the way through the 2000s as well. So whereas the growth in sectoral terms, number 1 in service sector activities, number 2 in manufacturing and other industry, number 3 in agriculture in the 2000s in Indonesia. And so we worried a little bit that the rate of growth of manufacturing in Indonesia is falling before it should. And one way we can see that is by comparing Indonesia to other developing and advanced economies in the East Asia region. So each of these data points here is a point relating the logarithm of per capita income in BPP prices to the share of manufacturing in GDP. So these are panel data, if you like, different countries at different points in their economic development. And if we just fit a naive polynomial to that, we get this kind of nice inverse U shape, which says that the poorest countries with the lowest per capita GDP have low manufacturing share in GDP. The richest countries also have a declining share of manufacturing in GDP. And in the middle, here's where we find countries like Thailand and Malaysia, where GDP's contribution from manufacturing is pretty high. And they're in the middle income in terms of per capita income. Now the red points here are Indonesia. So as Indonesia grows, its manufacturing sector grows much faster than the total economy for a while. And then during the 2000s, during the resource boom, it begins to fall away, apparently prematurely, if this trend continues. So this is why we kind of worried about the loss of competitiveness in manufacturing and the slowdown, relative slowdown of manufacturing growth in the overall Indonesian economy. Any questions so far? I still haven't started to talk about education, so I better go a little bit faster, right? Okay. Well, this table shows numbers which back up the story that I told, but maybe let's focus only on the bottom ones down here. If we look at changes in employment growth by broad industry, we see that during the 2000s, during the resource boom, employment growth in agriculture, 0.2% per year. The next lowest is employment growth in manufacturing, 0.9% per year. And the fastest rates of employment growth are taking place in construction, in transport, in other service sector activities. These are taking place at 3 or 4 times the rate of, or 2 to 4 times the rate of employment growth in manufacturing. So if you're a young Indonesian and you ask yourself, well, what kind of job can I expect to get when I leave school? Then at the margin, the answer is increasingly not a manufacturing sector job, but a job in some kind of service sector activity. That's what the data are telling us. And we see that when we, in a moment, when we look at the changing structure of employment in Indonesia. So, the labor market is evolving along with the rest of the economy. We've got this resource boom story with Dutch disease, and we've got the policy tightening story that I mentioned with more restrictive labor market policies, some trend towards more restrictive trade policies that also hurts manufacturing. And the consequence of this is a change in the sectoral structure of employment, especially for young Indonesians. And that structural change, as we'll see, involves both the sector in which people get a job, agriculture, industry, services. It also involves change in the employment institution that will apply to them, whether they have a formal sector job with some benefits or insurance or that kind of thing, or an informal sector job, often in a very small company, with no benefits and no job security and no minimum wage or anything else like that. We're going to see a big difference based on that. Very strong trend towards informality, partly because of sectors, partly because of these other policy factors which are driving firms out from the formal part of the economy to the informal part. A little bit like Mexico as well. And what we notice about the informal economy is, no surprise there, it's much lower paid, there's much less job security, and it turns out indeed that the gap between formal and informal earnings is widening over time. Let me show you some data to back all of that up. So here's the changing structure of employment for all workers in Indonesia. The blue bar is 1997, right before the economic crisis. And then the green bar is 2007, well through the employment boom that I've been, well, the resource boom that I've been talking about. And if you look at the whole labor market, you don't see much difference. A little bit of a decline in agriculture, a little bit of a rise in some of the big service sector activities. This is wholesale and retail trade, hotels and restaurants. This is community and personal services. It includes government, but most of it is not government. Then a little bit of a decline in manufacturing. We look at these numbers, we would say not much structural change in employment, right? Okay, a little bit, but not much. But this is for all workers, all ages. Let's focus now just on new workers, that is the youngest cohort of workers. This is their story from 1997, the blue bar, to the green bar, 2007. So this is only for workers under 21. Not much change in agriculture, but look at the changes that take place in manufacturing and services for new entrants to the labor market. In 1997, the prior probability of a manufacturing sector job was about 25%. Other things equal, there's a 1 in 4 chance that I'll move into, as a new worker, move into manufacturing. By 2007, that probability has fallen to about 17%, and it's been replaced by much higher probabilities of employment in wholesale and retail trade, local transport, restaurants, hotels, and other kinds of services over here. So the expectation among young Indonesians that they will get a job in manufacturing has fallen, and the expectation that they'll get a job in services has risen during this resource boom era. The other thing that I mentioned is that there's been a strong trend towards informality in the labor market. That's a response to a lot of things, including the policies that I mentioned. Of course, there are some advantages to being an informal firm, more flexibility, all of that kind of thing. But in general, informal firms have lower capital to labor ratios. They use less advanced technologies, and they are less productive in terms of output per worker than formal sector firms. So getting a job in an informal firm is usually associated with lower earnings as well as less stable earnings for workers. So if you're moving into the service sectors, and the service sectors are much less organized, much more informality in service sector employment compared with manufacturing, then you're also moving with higher probability into the informal labor market. So 1997, there was a much higher expectation among young Indonesians that they could get a job in manufacturing with a real job, with benefits and some kind of job security and a wage which reflects productivity in manufacturing. By 2007, that probability has diminished quite a lot. Yeah, yes.
I'm sorry, I just want to clear one more definition on the informal.
Yes, thank you. I will get to that in just a moment. Thank you for asking. So there is no agreement on how to define informality, as I suspect you know. And the two popular ways are you define it by whether the firm is incorporated or by whether the worker has some kind of formal labor contract with benefits or anything like that. We're using the second of those definitions. In the paper, there's a discussion of this. We start from the standard definition used by previous people working on the Indonesian economy, and then we make a correction, which we believe is justified, by noticing that under the standard definition, which includes formally incorporated firms, the rate of informality in Indonesian employment is very, very low compared with Thailand, or Vietnam, or Brazil, or any other reasonably comparable country. When we restrict the definition to only workers with formal contracts or with benefits, then we get a rate of informality which is right in the middle of the developing country range. So we choose that definition. We think it's more credible. And the paper, as I say, has more detail. Thank you for that question. Okay, so when we use the definition that I just described, here's the rate of informality that we get by sector. Agriculture, of course, is almost entirely informal. Manufacturing, more than half formal, almost half formal. Services, mostly informal, especially the big service sectors. And so, as those sectors grow in relative terms, there's a trend towards more informality. What does that mean for workers? Well, the blue line here is the trend in real wages for formal sector workers with contracts. The green line is the real wage trend for casual workers or for workers without labor contracts. And the dashed line is the ratio of the first to the second, of the blue to the green line. So you can see that while overall real wages in Indonesia have not been really dynamic, they haven't risen a lot, the difference between having a formal sector job in terms of earnings and an informal sector job has become somewhat wider over time. So as workers move into services, into informal employment, they get lower earnings as well. Okay, now we can start to talk about returns to education, because I've just tried to create an environment in which we think about how a young Indonesian asking themselves, should I stay at school or should I get a job? How they go about that process. What kinds of factors are important to them when they think about that decision. So now we're going to turn to some data, and the data is going to be organized in a way to allow us to fit kind of conventional earnings functions, Mincer earnings functions, which provide an estimate of returns to school. And in the standard Mincer equation, we know that returns to schooling depend on, earnings depend on schooling, years of schooling or levels of schooling attained, and on experience, and on other factors which condition those things, so under other controls which we know to be important. So we're going to begin from that standard Mincer earnings function, then we're going to use it in the Indonesian setting. And in particular, one adaptation that we need to make is that we need to control for selection into the formal sector. So am I going to get a formal job or not? That's going to depend on a lot of factors, as we see in just a moment. So there are lots of issues associated with this kind of estimation. In particular, the issue of do I join the labor force at all, especially for women? This is an important question. The previous history of use of this particular data set suggests that the selection issue is not an important consideration, that there's not a lot of bias in the earnings function that comes from failure to account for that selection issue. We can go into detail if you want to ask about it, but in the interest of saving time, I'll refer you to the paper for that discussion. We use a lot of controls to try to account for the selection issue there. Then we have the perennial problem, the big problem of earnings functions, which is how do you account for unobservable characteristics of workers that are representative of their cognitive ability, their motivation, other things like that that we can't address from survey data. And there are lots of approaches to this. The one that we're going to use, the two that we're going to use, first of all, adult height of workers, that is their height in 2007 in the labor force, because there's a very large literature that relates adult height to childhood or even prenatal health and nutrition. And that theory, the fetal origins theory that says that prenatal health is very important, and the early childhood theory, which says that what happens to you in the first 1,000 days of life, that is, before being born and the first 2 years after you're born. These theories say that we can tell a lot about adult cognitive ability based on what happens to the infant and the fetus before they're born. And that adult height turns out to be a very good predictor of conditions in that first 1,000 days of life. So we're going to use adult height based on that theory. It's going to turn out to be pretty important. And then as a second proxy, we're going to use parental assets, because we also know that what happens to you in the first 1,000 days of life is very closely associated with the assets that your parents have, both in terms of their wealth, their financial wealth, and also things like their education. Right? So the quality of the housing that they provide, the ability to provide the family with medical services and nutrition, all of those things are super important, and the assets of the parental household are really good proxies for that. So it almost doesn't matter which one of these we use. I'm going to show you results with both, but we're going to use this to account for exogenous early life circumstances that we believe are good proxies for adult cognitive ability and entrepreneurial flair and other things that we cannot otherwise measure directly. So that's going to be an important part of our estimation story. Very quickly on the data. We use the Indonesian Family Life Survey. This is a very large survey. It's a longitudinal survey. It has 4 waves beginning in 1993. The last wave was in 2007. That's why my data stopped there. And the intermediate waves in 1997, right before the Asian financial crisis, and in 2000 during the crisis, as far as Indonesia is concerned. A lot of data on individuals, on the households that they originate from, on the communities in which those households are found, and a very strong attention in this data set to reducing attrition. So the attrition rate from this data set over the 4 waves is extremely low by the standards of such data sets. That's a really big advantage of this, among other things. So a total of only about 10% over the entire 18 years, 4 waves of the data set. So that's a very good data set for our purposes. And we're going to use data from this data set on individuals who are of working age, 15 to 65, who report being in the labor force. So those who are currently employed. And most of the estimation is going to focus only on this wave in 2007, when the resource boom in Indonesia has already taken most of its effect. We're going to do some comparison with the pre-boom 1997 wave. Most of it's going to be the 2007 wave. And we're going to look at earnings, of course. We're going to relate those to education, measured here in years, although there's another version of this which looks at levels of education, which level of schooling you attain. Same results. We're going to look at, of course, at the tenure in the job, experience in the job, hours worked per year, these asset variables, including adult height and parental assets. And then we're going to look at formal and informal employment as well. These are our primary variables. There are some other controls, the region of Indonesia in which you live, whether you live in an urban or rural area, whether you're male or female, some other things like that. But I'm not going to pay attention to those today. The results for those are entirely predictable and are confirmed in the data. So nothing interesting to say about those things. Okay. So let's begin by asking a question about the link between the probability of formal sector employment and these origin variables, if you like. So this is a kind of a reduced form model in which we say, okay, let's forget about all of the intervening things like education and selection into occupation or sector, and let's just ask, is there any direct relationship between origins of the child, the first 1,000-day story, as measured by either their parental assets or their adult height, and the probability that that person as an adult will find a formal sector job? Because I argued that getting a formal sector job is really important for this whole story. Turns out this is going to matter a great deal. So here are two sets of probit results. The probit is on the probability of having a formal sector job in 2007. And we regress that on age, so we control for cohorts of workers. And we regress it on some other controls, which I've mentioned but won't discuss in detail. And then we also regress it on the log of parental assets and on adult height, each of which we think are representative of this unobservable cognitive ability of workers. And we find very strong, very significant results for both of those things. So that says that the reduced form says that if you have a good start in life, with good, you come from a better off household with better educated parents who have greater capacity to provide for you in terms of health and nutrition, then you're going to grow up into an adult who has a significantly higher probability of getting a job in the formal sector of the labor force. So origins matter, and this suggests intergenerational persistence. If you come from a good family, you've got a better chance of getting a higher paid job with greater stability. Okay? And, of course, as we'll see, of selecting into better occupations and all those as well. And, as it will turn out, a better chance of getting a higher return to education as well. So let me turn now to the earnings functions themselves. Lots of numbers. Let me walk you through the main ones. And I've suppressed all the numbers that I'm not interested in, okay, so as to not distract you with things. All right. So there are 3 sets of regressions, and there are 2 in each set. In the base regression, you can see the variables that we use here. In each pair of regressions, we use either adult height or family assets as our control for cognitive ability. And then we look at the influence of education on earnings after we interact that, in some cases, with other variables. So in the base case here, we just look at the direct effect of education after controlling for these cognitive ability variables. In the second pair of cases here, we include formal employment, because we know already that formal employment is a very powerful predictor of earnings, and we interact formal employment with education to get a richer measure of returns to education. In the third one, we add in controls for occupation, so selection into occupation, whether you're a professional or a technical worker, or a blue-collar worker, or a worker in clerical or service industry, that kind of thing, or in agriculture. And we also add selection into sectors, agriculture, industry, etc. Okay? So if we think of the first one as, if you like, pushing all of the variation across workers into their educational outcome, and then the second and third pairs of regressions are looking at indirect effects through selection by formal and informal employment, and or through selection into different occupations. So what do we see? First 2 columns, here are the estimated returns to education without controlling for things like formality and selection by occupation. And we find here numbers which are very broadly consistent with international data on the returns to education. That is, rate of return to each year of education of about 8 to 10%. Right? Very familiar numbers for those who study this kind of thing. Notice that even after controlling for education, we still have persistent effects of these unobservable cognitive ability variables that we're proxying in this way. So that stuff is still important. That means that when we take 2 workers with the same level of education, the worker who is taller, implying a better start in life, or the worker whose parental assets are greater, implying the same thing, still manages to earn significantly more. We're talking between 14 and 29% more based on those characteristics, even after controlling for education. Now let's unpack this another step further. So we know that informality is important. Let's look at what happens when we include a dummy for formal employment in the second set of regressions. That is very significant by itself, and so too is the interaction of formality with education. So now how do we read this? If you're a worker, let's take these numbers here. If you're a worker who is in the informal sector, then the then the unconditional, or rather the conditional return on education, conditional on being in the informal sector, is about 6.8% per year, or in the other set of estimates about 5.1% per year. If you're in the formal sector, then we're going to add this number down here, and we get to about 9% for workers in the formal sector, or about, well actually more than that, and then about 9% over here. So 9 to 10 or 11%, the kind of original figures that we saw down here. But that's only for formal sector workers, okay? And furthermore, if you're in the formal sector, then you also get a wage premium directly, independent of your educational attainment. So that we add all of these things up, getting a formal sector job has a huge effect on not only on your earnings, but also on the returns to your educational investment. That's what the numbers are telling us. In the last set of columns, we control further for selection into different occupations, and we find that the story gets stronger still. That the conditional return, if you're in the informal sector and you're selected into agriculture or low-skilled services sectors where there's no premium on earnings, then returns on your education are going to be in the range 4 to 5% per year, which is less than the rate of return on any investment. So now we're in the region where, should I stay at school or not? Well, probably not. If I expect to get a job in the informal sector, in agriculture, or in services, or in petty trade, or something like that, not worth my while to stay in school anymore. Okay? If you do stay in school, then of course your chances of getting a formal sector job rise, and the returns on education rise. So we add this number to this number, the interaction, and we get back to our relatively high rates of return on education once again. But the point of these regressions is that this kind of average rate of return that we see often in the data is just that. It's an average, and it doesn't tell us specific stories. If you come from a relatively poor background, a very poor start in life, then the return on education is also not very high. And that's both direct, but because you have lower cognitive abilities, but it's also indirect through selection into education and selection into formal sector employment and selection into better or worse occupations. So that two Indonesian youth, say 15 years old, one from a good start in life, one from not such a good start in life, can end up diverging by many, many tens of percentage points in their earnings and in the return on their educational investment. And that diversity of experience is the thing that I think is interesting in this data. Let me summarize what we've learned, and then I'll stop for a moment and ask for questions. So we've run a kind of a snapshot of earnings patterns. And what we've learned, I think, is the following: that for informal workers, the returns on educational investment are low, 4 to about 5.5%. In formal employment, they are significantly higher. The lower bound of those is 7 to 9% or thereabouts. If we add the additional formal sector premium, just from having a job with security and benefits, and probably in a sector like manufacturing, then their benefits start to rise even further. There are clearly and significantly persistent effects of early childhood experience that relate to cognitive ability. So not all workers are the same based on what they inherit at birth. And those things operate both directly and also through these intervening effects of education, formality, and occupation. So as the economy changes, as the structure of employment changes away at the margin for young workers, away from manufacturing and towards service sectors, non-tradable sectors where informality is high and returns to skill are low, what do we see happening in the Indonesian economy for workers? We see that there's a lower overall rate of real wage growth because the economy is moving towards lower skill employment. High skill employment in manufacturing is not growing very fast. So there's kind of a cap on real wage growth. Second thing, there are lower overall returns to educational investments. We see that as well, and particularly through the lower probability of formal sector employment. And then we also know that there are, for the modal worker in this economy, there are lower security of employment, not only lower expected returns to education, but also greater vulnerability to shocks, especially macroeconomic shocks like what has happened in the last 2 years, which is world commodity prices are no longer rising, they're falling. An economy which is dependent on commodity exports, like Indonesia, is now experiencing a correction, and that correction is translating into much lower stability in the labour market, especially for those in income-elastic occupations like service sector jobs. So there's kind of a lot of history in here, right? If you were lucky enough to be able to make good use of an education because you had good cognitive skills, and that got you into a formal sector job in either a high-skilled service sector like banking and insurance and finance, or in manufacturing, more likely, then you are also, not only are you earning more, but you're also much more secure as the economy undergoes macroeconomic fluctuations. If, on the other hand, you got not such a good start in life, so you weren't so productive at school, that ended up with less educational attainment, and also higher probability of selection into informal employment in a service sector of some kind, then you get lower earnings and greater and reduced returns to schooling and greater vulnerability to macroeconomic shocks. So now the labour force can go on to 2 tracks, the good track and the bad track, depending on a lot of exogenous factors that begin at the beginning of life for many students. I want to talk about cohort effects. I don't know. How's my time? Should I stop soon?
You maybe 15 minutes.
Oh, that much?
Are you sure? Yes.
Should have kept my mouth shut. Okay, if you're not bored, I'll talk about cohort effects just for a couple of slides, and then we'll talk about the big picture, and then I'll stop. Hopefully for 10 minutes, not 15. Okay. So what I've done so far is I've taken a snapshot in 2007, and I've looked at worker characteristics and earnings, returns to education, all that stuff. Okay? So what if some of this has to do with when you join the labour market, and we haven't controlled for it properly, or what if it has to do with the evolution of this labour market for different cohorts over time? So I'm going to divide the data now into 3 cohorts, young workers, middle-aged, well, middle workers, and older workers. You can see the age groups there. And I'm going to, first of all, rerun the 2007 data using cohort-specific interactions and intercepts. So I'm going to allow the earnings function to have different structure for each of these different 3 age groups, or these 3 cohorts of workers. Okay? And then I'm going to compare those outcomes with the same set of regressions for the pre-crisis year 1997. 1997 is an interesting year because at the time that the data were gathered, Indonesia was at the peak of an economic growth boom, which was based very much around manufacturing growth. The Indonesian manufacturing industry had an experience just like Thailand from about 1988, 89 through to the middle of the 1990s. Manufacturing really boomed, and a lot of job creation took place in manufacturing at that time. So the 1997 data reflect that era. The 2007 data reflect the effect of this, first of all, of the crisis, and then of this natural resource export boom during the 2000s, the China-driven growth, if you like. So we're going to compare these earnings functions, and specifically returns to educational investments between 2007 and 1997, and between cohorts in each of those years. See what we can learn. Here's the summary. I'll show you the numbers in just a moment, but here's what we're going to learn. Here's the takeaway from that. First of all, we're going to find that in 2007, the average earnings of old and young cohorts are about the same. The middle cohort, those workers 29 to 40 years old in 2007, gets significantly lower average earnings. And I think that's because that's the age group of workers who were young workers in the Indonesian labor force during the economic crisis of 97, 98, 99, 2000. So they've had a permanent effect on their income because they entered the labor market at a really, really bad time. Okay? So there's that story in there. in 1997, we're going to see that there is no, well, I'm going to tell you, that there is no difference across cohorts in earnings. And indeed, no difference across cohorts in return to education either. So 1997 was a very buoyant time for the labour market in Indonesia. And the data tell us that there's no significant within-year cohort effect in terms of earnings and returns to education. Those effects emerged by 2007, as you'll see in just a moment. And specifically, what we're going to see in 2007 is that even though in 1997 all workers look the same in terms of earnings and returns to skills, by 2007 there's a very big difference between young workers and older workers, and between workers in informal occupations and formal occupations across each of the age groups. That's what I'm going to show you now. Okay. So, first panel here is estimated returns to education given informal employment. Second panel is returns to education